Good evening, everyone. It's time to get started. Last week we were talking about the three categories that Solomon has described, or the three categories that he puts humans in, that he describes in the first 9 chapters of Proverbs: the wise, the fool, and the simple. And there's another lesson sheet back there. Part of it's continuation of last week, and then there's a new one back there that'll have some more questions on it. But I think we kind of finished off last week. We talked about the results of the fool, of his living in folly. He ambushes himself. Unbeknownst to himself, he's really ambushing himself. And we talked about how living a life of folly as a fool takes away life and basically destroys them. And I don't think I got to what was probably question number 9 on last week's sheet. How morally dangerous are fools? And if we look at 17:2, Proverbs 17:12, let a person meet a bear robbed of her cubs rather than a fool in his foolishness. And I've got to make a statement real quick. I keep talking about the fool, the fool, the fool. I'm going to add a part of that to say the fool in his folly. And I'll touch on that some more in a second. And it reminded me because it says a fool in his foolishness. Because as we get to talking about the fool, it almost sounds like I'm up here condemning him and saying the fool there's no hope for him. And in their folly, fully in their folly? Yeah, but I'll clarify that in a minute, and I won't get sidetracked. Because I want to tell my mom a bear story, because I love telling bear stories. I have a collection of them. I have 2 or 3 bear stories. I've probably told this story before. But this particularly talks about how dangerous is a fool. It's as dangerous as a mama bear after someone has robbed her of her cubs. And I think we all know that. A mama bear protects her cubs. And I do a lot of backpacking, and I'm an outdoorsy kind of guy. And me and Kaylee and Hannah years ago were hiking in the forest in Sequoia, big giant redwoods. And we were back there. We'd been hiking for 30, 40 minutes. We were back early in the morning. And we're booking it along pretty quick pace. And I'm in front, Kaylee and Hannah are in the back. And Kaylee starts freaking out. And she's like, there's bears, there's bears. And I'm like, oh, bears, cool. And where? And over there, 2 little bear cubs, right? And I say, I'm here, maybe about where James is 2 little bear cubs, right? And I'm like, oh, wow, look at the little bear cubs. Okay, then I immediately think, and this is a comical thing in my house, I'm like, where's the mama? Where's the mama? And so sometimes every once in a while, Kaylee and Hannah are like, hey, Dad, where's the mama? And they laugh at me. But that was my initial instinct, because where's the mama bear? Well, I'm walking on this path, and right maybe at the end of that pew, if that, big old giant, 15-foot diameter fallen redwood tree. And I'm about to pass it and cross paths with that and the 2 little cubs there. And Kaylee's like, the mama's right there. Well, the mama was cowered behind that big log. And luckily I stopped. And sure enough, the mom rears up and kind of stands up and like, whoa, that because bears fascinate me. I respect them. And sort of fear them, but I'm not stupid around them. So we did the get out of there, bear, and it made the big noise, and she ran over to the side where her cubs were, and then they ran off in the hills, and Kaylee's like, we need to go back. Dad, let's go back. And I'm like, it's all good. They're going off eating berries. But that mama bear, I still wonder, what if I would have been, knowing, look at the little cute little things there. And like, the mama bear, if I'm separating between them, that might have been possible attack there. But they're California black bears. It's not like a grizzly bear or nothing. But we know the fear of a mama bear and how she protects her cubs. And when you come between that, they're saying, hey, the danger of a fool is worse than that. So one of the things we've been talking about is we need to learn to discern these categories that Solomon is putting people in. We need to be able to discern what is a fool, who's a fool. There's some deception. We talked about Satan being the master of deception, the master of lies. But there's danger there, and that's why we need to learn to discern the fool. Now, it was brought up last week after class, and it was a very good point, and I want to kind of touch on it so I don't misconstrue anything here. But I was talking about the fool last week, and I know I made the statement of, you hear that thing, the statement of, oh, you fool. But it's brought up Matthew 5:22, whoever says you fool shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. So I want to clarify when I'm up here talking, I'm not talking about condemning the fool. And let's look at the context of Matthew 5:21 and 22. And this is from part of the Sermon on the Mount, I believe. And Jesus is saying, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not murder, and whoever commits murder shall be answerable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be answerable to the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be answerable to the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. So the context here goes back to a lesson I was talking about on the Ten Commandments, and we talked about how thou shalt not murder. And I was taking the Ten Commandments and then saying how Christ has expanded on them as he moves into the New Testament. And so in this context here, he's saying, well, yes, you know it's a sin, thou shalt not murder. The law says that. However, I suggest to you, not only is it wrong and sinful to murder, but it's wrong to be angry at a brother. And then he goes on to say, to call a brother a fool would be to call him worthless, to be insinuating that perhaps the world would be best rid of that person or better off without him. One short step of murder. And so I don't think in Matthew 5:22, when we talk about that it did not condemn the assessment of one's character, but the assassination of one's character. And so I want to make clear, I'm not sitting up here condemning the fool, but I am saying we need to be able to assess the character of the fool because we need to protect ourselves and guard ourselves in our actions towards them. Does that make sense? So how do we deal with the danger of fools? And I think I had question number 10. Read 26:4-5 and 29:9, and then I asked if confronted by a fool, how should we respond? Clay?
In looking at that word, I know there's two different definitions of fool. And the one in Matthew talks about one who is a godless one, as opposed to one who is arrogant in and of himself. So the question that you pose is, depending on what kind of fool you're talking about, would depend on how we're going to deal with that person. If they're an atheist and godless and preach against that, it's going to be different than talking to one who's just arrogant and thinks that he's above everybody else.
And that's a very good point Clay makes. Maybe there's perhaps degrees of a fool, and like Clay was saying, there's the one that's godless. And that's why I kind of added, and I think I might have put it on one of the questions, I put on there, a fool in his folly. And along what Clay was saying, when I'm talking about the fool here and what I believe Solomon is talking about in his reference to the fool is the fool in his folly. How we talked about last week, they hate knowledge. It goes so far as to say they have no belief in God. Those are the people we need to protect ourselves and watch out for. And that's the fool in his folly. So if we read these two verses here, it says, do not answer a fool according to his foolishness, or you will also be like him. Answer a fool as his foolishness deserves, so that he will not be wise in his own eyes. And then 29:9 says, when a wise person has a controversy with a foolish person, the foolish person either rages or laughs, and there is no rest. So from those two scriptures, did anyone kind of pick up on any comments on what do we do if we're confronted by a fool? And one of the things I'm thinking is we should not lower ourselves to his level. Don't give him undue honor. A fool is big-headed. It's all about themselves, and they want that attention. So we don't want to play his game. We don't want to get into an argument with him. We don't want to be more boastful than him. Don't want to tell lies like him. Uh, we don't want to, by all means, engage them in name calling and let them elicit the emotion of anger in ourselves. Larry?
I think that it comes from a personal thing where when we call someone a fool, we're feeling that we're in a position of authority, that we have the right to do so. Imagine you're talking to a godless person and you look at him and go, "You fool." What good does that do? If God does it, if Jesus does it, he has the right to, because he can discern what's inside of a person. And I think this is one of these things where we can look at a person and perhaps and say, "I think that's foolish. I think that's not wise." But when we make those decisions, aren't we becoming the judge, jury, and executioner by the way we phrase it?
Yeah, and that's kind of what I want to be careful in, that I'm not saying that by no means are we judging them, or we're not making a judgment, an assessment. I clearly think we're able to, I think we're called to make an assessment on their character so we know how to deal with them. And that's kind of what I want to touch on a little bit here, on how we deal with them. And yeah, like Larry says, if we go up there and we have, our guy at work that we're working with, well, I had the guy that I worked with that I brought my Bible to work one day, and he's like, "What? You're bringing your blinking Bible to work, Jeff? That's blah, 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 blah." And the dude, he was a known atheist, and I didn't engage him, but at the same time, I'm like, I never told him he was condemned, or I never called him a fool, but I knew how to guard and mind myself around that person. And I'll come to some more interesting points on that, Larry. Ian?
Kind of tying with Larry's point, it seems like there is a necessity to address a behavior, but we can do so without assassinating the character. In Titus, I think it was, it talks about how you to avoid foolish controversies, genealogies, and so forth. We're also told to speak the truth in love, right? And that should, and I think Proverbs is going to address that in myriad of ways. I don't want to step all over your lesson, but we can speak the truth in love and address foolishness and allow somebody who maybe has some behaviors to become enlightened. And that's obviously only through God's word, through the wisdom that he shares with us and being a part of us. And I think that Proverbs speaks how we can do that.
That's, yeah, very good point. And that's kind of in a roundabout way where I'm going to get here too. And I kind of, where I'm talking about right now is, in my mind, as I'm thinking of this, I'm thinking more of engaging someone in our everyday lives. You've got that annoying neighbor. You've got your arrogant, non-Christian boss that's always foul-mouthed and barking orders. And like Clay was saying, I don't know if that guy's a fool in his folly. And like I say, I clarify that where he has, he despises knowledge, he hates wisdom, he will not listen to rebuke. But he's definitely giving me the keys there that, hey, he doesn't like me as a Christian or whatever. So I'm going to kind of mind my way about how I'm dealing with him at that level. And as we get here and just a little bit further, we'll see at some point, it's, is there a point that you don't deal with the fool? Look at these things. It says, do not attempt to correct him. Because if you look at verse 29:9, the fool in his folly, he's either going to rage or laugh or just carry on and ignore you until you're exhausted. Verse 14:7, it says, leave the presence of a fool, or you will not discern words of knowledge. So just like the mama bear, ideally, avoid him. We try to avoid the fool. Verse 22:10, and this brings up, I don't want to get too heavy into this because this is kind of a touchy subject, but Proverbs 22:10, it says, drive out the scoffer and strife will leave. Even quarreling and dishonor will cease. So it's getting that, the fool should be driven out. And I have 1 Corinthians 5, 9 through 13. It's pretty lengthy. I think we're familiar with it. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. I did not at all mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or with the greedy and the swindlers, or with the idolaters, for then you would have to leave the world. But actually, I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother if he is a sexually immoral person, or a greedy person, or an idolater, or is verbally abusive, or habitually drunk, or a swindler, not even to eat with such a person. For what business of mine is it to judge an outsider? Do you not judge those who are within the church? But those who are outside, God judges. Remove the evil person from among yourselves. And then along those same lines, Matthew 18, 15 through 17. Now, if your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take one or two or more with you, so that on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses every matter may be confirmed. And if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, he is to be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. So that's a heavy subject right there that I really don't want to get into, but I bring it up as a point that even the New Testament teaches that Christians should not fellowship with those who are willfully living in sin and disregard biblical rebuke and instruction. So that's one of the key things, too, of a fool in his folly. He completely disregards any biblical rebuke and instruction. So we can see kind of the importance of being able to decipher the character or the category of the fool, and being able to have the wisdom to deal with that. We've all been going to church long enough that I'm sure at some point there was some type of situation where there was a disagreement amongst the brethren and whatnot. I've experienced, I know over the course of times it's been experienced, and it's ugly, it's terrible. Imagine when we start talking about, this is where the wisdom starts to make sense, is think of how wise the person has to be to come in and handle that and deal with that. And I think I made a comment last week when we talked about the wise, how they were able to, I should have wrote this down, they were able to soothe, like soothing water, the troubled soul of people and turmoil. They could come in and have something to do with oil and water. But it was a great statement of how the wise person can turn over turmoil that way. Slide 23, or not 20, verse 20, chapter 23, 9. Sorry, it says, "Do not speak to be heard by a fool, for he will despise the wisdom of your words." So I think Solomon's saying here, don't waste your instructions on a fool. If he's full-blown, that he's not going to listen, he hates knowledge, and I'm going to keep going on this, so don't get too nervous yet. I'm hoping I'm going to clarify what I'm saying here. But it says, do not speak to be heard by a fool, for he will despise the wisdom of your words. And again, I'm going to clarify, a fool in his folly. There's no reasoning with them. And at a certain point, don't waste your time on them. And I will come back to that. And Matthew 7:6. I think this verse was, over the summer we had that little, the summer program was on the Sermon on the Mount. And I think this scripture ended up being in the little part that I was covering. And I actually was like, I never really spent a whole lot of time on it. And I kind of looked at it, and it was interesting. Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. So when we're dealing with a fool in his folly and his refusing to listen to rebuke, his refusal to listen to any type of instruction, at a certain point, like I said last week, they don't like to be preached to. So are we not to evangelize to the fool? And that's kind of where I want to clear this all up. Am I saying that a fool, like Larry's kind of talking about, am I condemning the fool? No. And I don't think we have to be careful. We can't go there. We can't just, we can decipher the category and think in our minds, okay, well, I need to guard myself around this person, but we can't condemn them. And along the lines of like what Ian was saying, what our job is to try to get the gospel to them. And that's where it takes a great deal of wisdom. And I'll get some opinions from you guys, because this is a tough one, but I'm drawn to the parable of the prodigal son in Matthew 15. And you know, he stooped so low that he was actually living amongst the pigs. And if you read it, it says he was living amongst the pigs and he came to his senses. Okay, so there was a point that the prodigal son had stooped so low, and I'm pretty sure he was living the life of folly and probably didn't want to hear the rebuke of his father, the rebuke of any of the townspeople that, why are you doing this? He's, I'm going to continue to do whatever I want to do. I would think in my mind a fool in his folly. Okay? But he fell so low, and he reached that low point that he eventually, as he was lying there amongst the pigs, he came to his senses. So we know from the scripture the way of the transgressor is hard. The folly of a fool will bring many difficulties. But I think we must not hinder fools from entering the pig pens of life, if that makes sense. For it's there that they may actually come to their senses and to begin to recognize their folly. And I don't know why, in my mind, I think of the drug abuser, and I think of the, I guess it's from my job and working around that I deal with it, but, the heroin user, the addiction, and at what point they finally come to rock bottom and realize, I got to get out of this rut. But I think sometimes when you have that fool in his folly, you just kind of have to step back and let them get to the point of where they're going to change. And if we look at the prodigal son when he came home, he was a different person, right? He came home with a humbled and repentant heart. It's the first thing he did is went and apologized to his father. So when a fool has hit rock bottom and realizes his folly, he's then more susceptible to instruction. He then might listen to some wisdom and some knowledge. And we talked last week, wisdom is offered to all men. And in fact, we're going to read here in a minute where the fool is urged to turn from his folly. So we cannot reason. It's going to be really hard to sit there and argue and debate and try to get this through discussion, this fool out of his folly. Because to change, he has to have a transformation in his heart. And the only way to help the fool is by proclaiming to them the way of salvation. Only the gospel can transform the man, and this kind of goes to what Ian was saying. And I think ultimately what I'm coming around to is I'm saying we need to guard ourselves against the fool, but at the same time, we need to be able to plant the seed. And I think that's about all we can do. And I'm thinking, keep a watchful eye and wait for them to accept a change of heart. And in my mind, I'm thinking typically it's probably going to be a loved one. Could feasibly be a coworker. It's probably someone you probably have a close inner dealing with. And I don't know, maybe folks here have seen their children step away from the church or whatever it may be. And I think you just have to plant that seed and say, hey, your heart's not in the right place. I'm not going to argue with you. You got to, like with Ian says, with patience and with love and wisdom. I think that's where wisdom comes in, is to be able to patiently deal with the fool and be able to let it know, hey, when you're willing to change your heart and come out of your folly, the Lord can save you. And as a Christian, it should be known to that person that's a loved one or whoever that they can come to us when they're willing to change their heart. But I think we plant the seed and we keep a watchful eye out and wait for them to accept a change of heart. Any questions on that? That was a long old point. Hopefully I said what I wanted to say right. And any comments on that? Okay, so hopefully I didn't say nothing terrible. Ian? Right. Yeah, it's kind of tough to grasp to say that, like, hey, don't. Well, I think you can just plant your seed and wait and plant the seed out there to them and wait until they are willing to accept it and come back. Um, so, any more questions before I kind of move on from the category of the fool? Okay, so now I'm going to move on to uh, the simple person or the naive person, and not a whole lot. Well, there is a lot there, but in my little scripture up there, there's not a whole lot. So, Proverbs 1:4 says, to give prudence to the naive, or to the King James Version says the simple, to the youth knowledge and discretion. So with that, and I don't know if you guys read any more into it, there's definitely some stuff in there that we're going to look at, but I think I asked the question, describe who is the simple, who is the naive, what is this category of person that Solomon is describing? He's obviously inexperienced, okay, and clearly not stupid. That's not what Solomon is talking about here. We're not talking about Lenny of Mice and Men or something like that, or some kind of a mental disability or mentally slow or capability there. That's not what we're talking about. I think the key thing is they're impressionable and easily misled. Immature, and typically this little category here is typically characterized as youthful or the teen, adolescence. And then, if you think about youth are more inclined toward their peers than their parents, right? If kids have an issue, they usually have a tendency now, especially with social media and all these platforms that kids could talk to and text and whatnot. I think Abby, she's just like a psychologist. She's always solving people's problems. She's always on the phone. Well, you need to go, and all up in the mix. But usually it's her fixing everybody's problems. That's Abby. Janine?
Yeah, in a way, this verse is the subject of what this book is teaching. Verse 4.
The subject of what?
What this book is teaching.
The subject of what this book is teaching? Pretty much, I think it says there to accept or to get knowledge, to get wisdom. It is kind of that part of it, because that is what Proverbs is about, is getting wisdom and knowledge, and we really need to try to get it to the young and the naive. But they're very susceptible to external influence, okay? But is it just the youth? If you look at, I'm not going to look at these scriptures, but we know that Paul warns Timothy about the dangers of youthfulness. And if you look at chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6 of 1 Timothy, there's enough warnings that Paul is giving Timothy about the dangers of youthfulness. But then Paul also goes on, and we get into Titus. He definitely has instructions for the older saints as well. So I don't think that this idea of being susceptible to external influence is predominantly just youthful people, or just youthful. And you all heard that term, a midlife crisis. And what better one than David, in 2 Samuel 11, and the whole situation that David went through with Bathsheba, which resulted in murder, and just a whole ugly situation. What a terrible midlife crisis. So temptation is always there. Okay? Temptation is always there. But when we think of this category of the simple or the naive person, we typically want to, it's designed towards, or typically more characterized towards youthfulness, but I think it could be anyone. And I was kind of thinking, could it be us? Could it be applicable to us in times of weakness? We all sin and fall short of the glory of God. Do we sometimes look to the world for wisdom? Do we sometimes get sidetracked? Any comments on that? Okay, so question number 2 on the news sheet that I had out here tonight, is being simple a sin? being simple a sin? And let's look at 1 Corinthians 3, 1 and 2. And I just know we're familiar with this as well. And I, brothers and sisters, could not speak to you as spiritual people, but only as fleshly, as infants in Christ. I gave you milk to drink, not solid food, for you were not able to consume it. But even now you are not able. So I don't think it's a sin, but it's a phase. It's a phase in one's growth towards maturity. And so Paul's talking to the church at Corinth and saying, hey, yeah, when I first came here, and you guys were babes in Christ, yeah, I gave you milk. And so they were obviously, I guess, in that category of being simple, naive at that point. They weren't condemned for it. They weren't, Paul didn't say that there was any shame in it. He's like, that's why I gave you milk. Okay. However, when Paul writes this here, some time had gone by, and there should have been some degree of maturity. And when you start getting into willful ignorance and immaturity, or the failure to progress, then that could lead to sin. But simplicity is simply a stage in one's growth. But one cannot remain simple just as one cannot remain an adolescent. If you think of teens, can't be a teenager forever. I'm sure there's, kids that would love to. I'm sure there's all those 18, 19, 21-year-old kids that are still living the crazy life of just irresponsible being a teenager. But at some point, you kind of have to grow up. And that's kind of the thing with that category of simple/naive. It's a passing phase. And to get through it, you're either going to be persuaded down the path of folly, or you're going to be persuaded down the path of wisdom. And that's where we need to decipher those types of people, because we need to get them down the path of wisdom. Dean?
Speak to that point, it reminded me of when Jesus said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they should be filled. And it seems like Paul kind of uses that same analogy as far as food goes. Like you're stuck with the milk, and you should have been progressed to this part of your food. You're obviously not hungry enough to go after this. That's why you're not doing it. And so I think there is definitely what might be a negative connotation, the idea of, well, you're just still a baby, but you're not actually hungering after these fruits. You're just kind of buying them, all right, this is good enough.
Yeah, it almost kind of goes along with the idea of what we would think as someone that falls into this category of the simple or naive is they don't have that gumption, that get up and go to strive for it. We talked about last week, wisdom, it's there. God gives it to us, it's there, but with the stipulation. You have to go after it. You have to go get it. And to get it, you have to study and devote yourself. And I think that's one of the characteristics of the simple or naive also, is that they're not quite willing to go after it yet also. Judy?
To be curious. You need to be curious. Otherwise, you have no motivation either.
Okay,
Curiosity, you got to, well, why this, how's this, and then that's how you progress as well.
true. And hopefully you're curious in the right way, because that kind of comes into my my next point I want to make. And I think for us, as Christians, we're curious about wanting to learn more about God's Word, and that curiosity should drive us towards that goal. But there's also that curiosity of the dark side, the other side, that path, and that's to the simple or the naive person, it's almost more alluring to go down that path of folly. And if you would turn to Proverbs chapter 7. And this is part of the personification of Madam Folly. I'm going to clear that up in a minute. I don't know if we'll get there tonight or not. But we've been talking about how Solomon is going to personify two women, one representing the path of wisdom, one representing the path of folly. And I haven't got into it fully yet, but I want to pull from this story of the lady that represents foolishness and folly to show you how the simple or naive get caught up in it. And if you have chapter 7 there, the first part I'm looking at is verse 6 through 9. And this is actually the way it's written right now. This is the personification of the lady that represents wisdom, documenting her observation of the naive on his way to Madame Folly's house. And it says, "For at the window of my house I looked out through my lattice, and I saw among the naive and discerned among the youth a young man lacking sense, passing through the street near her corner. And he walks along the way to her house in the twilight, in the evening, in the middle of the night, in the darkness." So here, Lady Wisdom is telling of her observation of someone simple, someone naive, walking near Madame Folly's house. Okay, why is he walking that way? Why is he going down that path towards her house? Oh, I heard about this lady over here. I'm going to go walk over here. I wonder if I can see her. Why is he out at twilight? You know, as the night sets in. I don't think he's there by accident. It's that allurement or that curiosity of sin. And that's where the power of sin and the power of Satan comes in, because he grabs a hold of curiosity, because we're curious. And like Judy was saying, hopefully we can persuade that curiosity towards being curious of God's Word. But Satan has really big claws dug into us of getting that curiosity towards the allurement of sin. So he's going down this path of folly, or wandering over there to see what it's all about. And if you look at verse 10, and behold, a woman comes to meet him. Now this is the woman that is personified as folly and foolishness, dressed as a prostitute and cunning of heart. What should he do? Run. He's like, it should be like curious. You think when you're little kids and you grow around the neighborhood, that old man, I heard he's a murderer. Don't ever go to old man Johnson's house. Oh, there he is. Oh, no. And little kids kick off running or some stupid thing like that. Okay, that's kind of how, this is. Oh, there she is. Run. Okay, but no, he doesn't. And then it gets a little more into verse 13. It says, so she seizes him and kisses him. And with a brazen face, she says to him, I was due to offer peace offerings. Today I have paid my vows. Therefore I have come out to meet you, to seek your presence diligently, and I have found you. I have spread my couch with coverings, with colored linens of Egypt. I have sprinkled my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let's drink our fill of love until morning. Let's delight ourselves with caresses, for my husband is not at home. He has gone on a long journey. And here the simple is seduced by temptation. Again, what should he do? Run. But let's go up to verse 21 and 22, the first part of 22. It says, with her many persuasions she entices him. With her flattering lips she seduces him. Suddenly he follows her as an ox goes to the slaughter. He's done. Temptation is set in, and here he is allured into Madame Folly in that path of foolishness. And coulda, shoulda fled, but he stayed. Now it comes back, and now Solomon's versing himself again, and Solomon's more in the context of talking to his son about it, and he's telling the son, don't let your heart turn aside to her ways, referring to this personification of foolishness. Don't let your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths. So we see here that it's the problem is in the heart. We have to protect our heart from the ways of folly. So just as the fool was an issue of the heart and had to have a change of heart, so I think naivety, or the simple person is there too, but to some small degree, and you can't really blame it or use it as an excuse, but there's naivety about it. That's a factor there. Any comments on that? So we begin to see these two characters, what I'm loosely referring to as Lady Wisdom and Madame Folly. Their allurement, they're called to the path, they're trying to lure people in. So let's change pace here, and I got to question number 3. It says, though the simple and the fool may share some similar characteristics, Why is there hope for the simple and none for the fool? And then I went in and added in his folly. I think I've made that point clear where I'm going for that, the fool in his folly, right? So why is there hope for the simple and none for the fool in his folly? And I think we've been talking about susceptible to influence. The fool in his folly is not real susceptible to influence. He's got it set in his head. My way is what it is. It's, the wisdom is right here. This is how I am. This is what I'm going to be because that's what I want to do and that's what I'm going to be. The simple or the naive, they're still looking. Like Judy said, they're still curious. They might start to find out, hey, there is two paths out here. What's this other path about? They can still be persuaded. They can be persuaded to seek wisdom, or they can be persuaded, just like we read there in chapter 7, by the path of the fool. Verse 1, chapter 122. Now this is the personification of Madam Wisdom, or Lady Wisdom. And she says, "Oh, how long, oh, you naive ones, will you love simplicity?" She's calling for them to come out of their simplicity, advance on to knowledge. So they're very susceptible to the ways of evil and the path of the fool. But the Lord offers opportunity for the right path. And I have Psalms 19:7. The law of the Lord is perfect, restoring the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. Any questions on the simple or the naive? I can get a little bit of a start on the two paths. So now I want to look at the two paths as depicted by Solomon through the tale of the metaphorical women. And I've been touching on them all along, and so I'm not going to go too depth into the scriptures of them because I've been actually, if I'm talking about the benefits of wisdom, well, those scriptures that we already read were probably the personification of wisdom already. But there are some points I want to make about their character. So Solomon spends a great deal of time in the first 9 chapters telling us about these two different types of women. We know Solomon had knowledge of women. It was his downfall, right? It was his weakness ultimately. We talked about that already. He definitely had some allurement to women, and I don't know that he had knowledge about women, but they were very much a part of Solomon's life, so it would be common that he would use them in this context that he does when he's presenting this to his son here. He knew the temptation and allurement of women, and he used it to teach his son in both a literal sense and metaphorically. And if we take these character or these personifications of the two ladies here, Lady Wisdom and then Madam Folly, you can clearly get some literal lessons from it. And it's pretty crafty that Solomon did it this way. You can see there when I'm talking about in chapter 7, there's definitely some context of sexual purity there. And Solomon clearly warning his child, his son, stay away from this woman, stay away from this adulteress. So in a literal sense, we can look at some of the teachings here as lessons in sexual purity. We can look at it as lessons in the type of a female mate that our sons should seek, or the type of moral woman a female should strive to be. There's lessons on inner beauty versus outward allurement. There's definitely some literal things that can be taken from this. But metaphorically, they personify two ways through the literary tool of personification. And I'm sure Ian will probably get into that literary tool of personification. And I'm not as good as he is, but I'm sure this is a perfect example of personification. So, Lady Wisdom. And I'm saying Lady Wisdom because I've read several different sources on this and studies on it, and that's kind of what they refer to them as. But it's basically the female character that is representing or personifying wisdom. For the lack of better term, we'll refer to her as Lady Wisdom. And then the other one is folly, the way of the fool, and that is Madam Folly. We were reading about her in chapter 7 that we just read there. So both of them are in pursuit of man. Both of them are urging man to follow their path. Okay, let's look at Lady Wisdom, and let's see how she urges men to follow her path. And we'll look at 9, 1 through 6, and 1, 21 through 22. It says, Wisdom has built her house. She has carved out her 7 pillars. She has prepared her food. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has sent out her attendants. She calls out from the tops of the heights of the city. Whoever is naive, let him turn in here. To him who lacks understanding, she says, come, eat of my food and drink of the wine I have mixed. Abandon your foolishness and live, and proceed in the way of understanding. And then 1:21 through 22, again, how she gets her message out there. It says, Wisdom shouts in the street. She raises her voice at the public square. At the head of the noisy street, she cries out. At the entrance of the gates in the city, she declares her sayings. So she's inviting who is ever naive, the simple that we just talked to. They're the ones that need that influence. They're the ones that are easily impressionable. She's begging for them to come in. She even invites the fool. Says, come get rid of your folly. She shouts out her invitation to all. She broadcasts it out in the front at the city gates. She makes it well known, boldly proclaims her invitation. Now, look at the difference of Madam Folly if we go to chapter 9, 14 and 18. She sits at the doorway of her house, on a seat by the high places of the city, calling to those who pass by, who are going straight on their paths. Whoever is naive, let him turn in here. And to him who lacks understanding, she says, stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But he does not know that the dead are there, that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. So now you see a different kind of, she's not out in the city streets proclaiming her word. She's sitting on her front porch and hollering out at people as they walk by. Hey, come over here. Hey, come over here. You see, there's secretive allurement. She can't shout out in the public gates because she's been shunned. Okay, she's an adulteress, so she's been shunned. So she's trying to get people that walk by that are like that young man we just read about. Okay, that was a perfect victim for her. Hey, come here. She focuses on the simple and the naive. There's no call there for her calling out to the fools because she's already got them. But it's interesting, she says she's also calling out to those who are making their paths straight. So that temptation, that allurement of sin, that path towards foolishness, that temptation's still there, even to those that are making their paths straight. Their message is clearly different, and I'll finish with this point. Lady Wisdom warns of the death and destruction of folly's path. She tells her guests what they need to hear. She doesn't have to allure them with what they want to hear. She's straightforward, speaking of noble things, and we've touched on some of these scriptures here. She speaks of noble things. She has counsel and sound wisdom. She promises security. She promises peace, long life, riches, and honor. And most of all, life, eternal life. Now, Madam Folly, she gives no thought to her own fate, nor does she warn men that following her leads inevitably to death. Now, if Lady Wisdom's appeals to the spiritual, then what Madam Folly does is she stimulates the sensual impulses of the simple, that allurement of sin. And like we read in chapter 7, she dresses seductively, and she speaks erotically of her bed and its spices and its expensive coverings. So she's trying to allure the victim with fleshly love. I think it's 8. So I think this is a good place to stop. I have two more points I want to make real quick about. I want to go over some of the characteristics of Madam Folly and go over some of the characteristics of Lady Wisdom. We'll get that next week is singing, but I think I can kind of speed over those 2 points real quick for the first 5 minutes or so of my next class, and then we'll get on from there. But any questions or comments? All right, thank you for listening.